There has been fighting in Ukraine at the hands of Russian forces for over 6 months now, and there is no sign that it will cease soon. Millions of civilians are unable to go back to their homes, and hundreds of thousands of people are dead or injured. Despite these tragedies, two questions remain unanswered. Why is Russia so desperate to control Ukraine? And is this merely a localized war, or does it affect the entire planet? Want to know those answers? Let's explore this in this video. Welcome back to Fanatics. We are dedicated to bringing you the most shocking and downright unbelievable real-life incidents that stunned the world. Today, we're going to discuss the situation in Ukraine. The war continues to have a significant influence on markets around the world and the availability of food and overall living conditions. We'll take a look at the beginnings of the conflict and attempt to answer the questions on everyone's minds. Why is Russia so desperate for victory in their war with Ukraine? And what does it mean for the world? Also, please like and subscribe so we can provide you with more exciting content. Why did Russia wage war in the first place? Why did this conflict start in the first place? What is it that Russia wants from Ukraine? And why is it so desperate to reclaim this newly established country? The answer is not a simple one. In the wake of the Soviet Union's demise in the early 1990s, NATO grew eastward, absorbing the vast majority of the European countries that had previously been under the influence of the Soviet Union and its satellites. NATO expanded with the addition of the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, all of which were formerly part of the Soviet Union. This resulted in NATO countries' borders now becoming hundreds of miles closer to Russia's capital, Moscow. In 2008, NATO announced its possible intention to enlist Ukraine. However, at that time, the chance of Ukraine making it into NATO was a long shot. These NATO actions upset Russia to a great extent, creating tension between Russia and its neighboring states. Putin also stated that the Soviet Union's collapse was one of the worst events of the 20th century because it prevented Russia from rising to its due place among the world's major powers. Over the course of his 22 years in office, Putin has tried to restore Russia's military and re-establish the country's international standing. The president of Russia has expressed concern over NATO's growth and the possibility of Ukraine joining the alliance. His criticisms of NATO have intensified as Russia has become more aggressive and militarily powerful. He has regularly objected about American and NATO missiles and troops in Ukraine. In December 2021, Russia issued written demands to NATO and the United States, citing the need for measures to safeguard Russia's security after the breakup of the Soviet Union. The main demands were a promise that Ukraine would never join NATO, a reduction of NATO's presence in the Eastern European nations that have already joined, and a return to the ceasefire that was negotiated in 2015 in Ukraine, the meaning of which is hotly contested by Moscow and Kyiv. Putin also has long maintained that Ukraine is closely connected to Russia both culturally and historically. In essence, Putin claims that Ukraine is a historical extension of Russia. He points to the fact that many Ukrainians consider themselves ethnically Russian and share a common cultural heritage with their northern neighbors. According to Putin, these deep historical ties make it impossible for Ukraine to be independent from Russia. Ukraine, however, disputes this claim. In addition, mass protests in Ukraine at the beginning of 2014 led to the ouster of a president who was strongly linked with Mr. Putin, significantly worsening relations between the East and the West. Russia invaded and occupied the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea very quickly in response to the political change. Since 2014, Ukraine has prepared for war with Russia. However, despite the preparations, Putin rallied his country's army to attack Ukraine. The Russian leadership expected the war to last only days. Initially, Putin was able to muster the support of his people based on propaganda and minimal impact on the population's daily lives. However, as the conflict in Ukraine drags on, it is becoming increasingly clear that the Russian people are not as supportive of the war as they once may have been. What used to be a relatively popular and well-supported military intervention now faces increasing criticism both at home and abroad. Many analysts attribute this shift in support to several key factors, including growing economic uncertainty due to Western sanctions, diminishing returns from military operations, and government propaganda that has fallen out of step with public sentiment. Overall, it seems that the conflict in Ukraine is causing significant damage within Russia itself, and is also starting to undermine national unity and confidence The Russian government. In some sense, the war that was intended to return Russia to its former glory may be responsible for creating its demise. We can infer from all of this that Putin is determined to go back in time over 3 decades, creating a large Russian-dominated security zone reminiscent of Moscow's influence during the Soviet era. And even though Putin is 69 years old and may be nearing the end of his political career, he is definitely trying to bring Ukraine, now a country of 44 million people, under the Russian flag. The effect of this war on the world. There is no doubt that this war, despite being localized to Ukraine, has had global implications. Prior to the war, Ukraine exported enough grain to provide nourishment for 400 million people all over the world. The inability of Ukraine to export grain in the first 5 months of the conflict contributed to a worsening of the worldwide hunger crisis, which had a terrible effect in many different parts of the world. Famine is now also on the horizon for East Africa due to a severe drought that has struck the region and the interruption in food supplies created by the Ukraine conflict. There are currently more than 14 million people in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya who are on the edge of hunger, and almost half of these are children. If the international community does not take immediate action, that figure could reach 20 million, which is close to double the population of Portugal or Sweden. In addition, the war has had an enormous impact on worldwide trade and energy supplies. The disruption to supply and demand is exacerbating the already unacceptable human toll of the conflict. Global trade has been seriously hampered by disruptions resulting from the war, and Europe is struggling to meet its needs due to the disruption of its natural gas supplies. And lastly, let's see where the whole conflict is heading. Will we be roped into a war? World War III? Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky made a surprising proposal for fast-track membership into NATO on September the 30th, just hours after Russian President Vladimir Putin formally proclaimed the annexation of up to 18% of Ukraine. Due to the need for approval from the other 30 members of NATO, Ukraine's full membership is still a ways off. However, a Russian Security Council official was quoted as warning that admitting Ukraine into the US-led NATO military alliance would guarantee the escalation of the situation in Ukraine into World War III. Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, has long criticized the United States for supporting NATO's eastward expansion, particularly its courting of ex-Soviet republics like Ukraine and Georgia, which Russia considers part of its own sphere of influence. Against what he called nuclear blackmail from major Western powers, Putin warned the West that he was not kidding when he stated he would be ready to use nuclear weapons to defend Russia. President Joe Biden of the United States has also warned that the threat of nuclear Armageddon is at its highest point since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. If Ukraine is admitted to NATO and Russia does decide to fire a nuke, there is no turning back. The situation would escalate quickly, and the major powers would have to jump in. A world war would be imminent with NATO on one end and Russia with its allies on the other. To prepare for this worst-case scenario, NATO conducts its annual Steadfast Noon nuclear drill. But in the end, we cannot be too sure of anything regarding the conflict. What Russia is planning to do, only Russia knows for sure. What is within our power is to hope for the best. Peace. Not just for these two countries, but for the entire world. Where we will head, only time will tell. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please help us to continue providing similar stories by liking and subscribing to our channel. Until next time.